everybody. We're going to start out our first geometry lesson learning a little bit about naming and geometry notation, okay? The big idea in this lesson is that it's going to be really, really important to use precise language. So if I describe something, you know exactly what geometric concept I'm talking about. You have a figure that comes to mind. If you try to name something and somebody else names that same thing, that you're using similar terminology so there's no confusion. Okay? Now I want to start off with a question for you. And I would normally ask the class, but I'm just going to ask you in the video, and I'd like you to think about this. If I draw this on the board, is that a point? Okay? And number two, if I draw that on the board, is that a line? Okay? Now the fact that I'm asking about it suggests that maybe there's something kind of strange going on here. Why is this not exactly a point? Why is that not exactly a line? All right? Well, a couple of things. First of all, if you think about it, a point has no dimensions. Okay? A point has no dimensions. What am I talking about when I say that a point has no dimensions? Well, think about this. What does it mean for something to be three-dimensional? Okay? The desk you're sitting in or the chair you're sitting in is three-dimensional. Your computer is three-dimensional. What does that mean? Well, what that means is something that's three-dimensional has a length and a width and a height. It has three dimensions. If I talk about something being two-dimensional, if I draw a triangle, for example, it's got basically like a length and a height, but it doesn't have any kind of width. It doesn't have any kind of depth. Okay? If I draw this here, which we'll talk about in a second, that has a length. It doesn't really have any width. Okay? In actuality, if I talk about a point actually has 0 dimensions. All right? Which means it has no length, it has no width, it has no height. It is literally just a position, but it doesn't take up any space. Now, I make that symbol to represent a point, but that dot has some width and it has some height. Okay? But that's the best we can do. We use a dot to represent a point. So the answer is that's the symbol that we use to represent a point. Technically, a point is just a position, maybe a spot in space right here at the tip of my finger, or this spot right here on the board. But it technically wouldn't have any width or any height. Okay? How do you name a point? Well, typically we're going to name points using letters, and specifically we're going to use capital letters. So maybe I could call this point A, something like that. And by the way, there's not an actual symbol when you name something. You could just refer to A, and people know that that's a point. You could also refer to point A, and you can actually write out the word. There's not a symbol. You don't put like a dot over the A or anything like that. Okay? Number two, my question was, is that a line? And hopefully you're sitting at home saying, no, that's not a line. That's a line segment. Okay? There's a difference. A line goes on infinitely in both directions. And by the way, when we use the term line in this class, I know if you're in 3rd grade or something, you probably say, oh, I drew a squiggly line. When we talk about lines, we're going to be talking about lines that are straight. Okay? That's what a line is going to refer to in a geometry class. So anyway, we could say that this is a line segment. And a line segment has endpoints. Maybe it starts at point B and it ends at point C, something like that. Another good question, how many points are on this line segment? Now, a lot of you might look at this and say, oh, there are 2 points. But there are lots of other points that just aren't labeled. There's a point here, and there's a point here, and there's a point here, and there's a point between those 2 points, and between those 2 points, and between those 2 points, and so on and so forth. In other words, there are infinitely many points, even on the line segment that has endpoints. So how do you name a line segment? Very simple. You list the 2 endpoints, and you put a little line segment over the top. The order does not matter. So you could name this line segment BC. You could also name it line segment CB. Notice again, I'm using capital letters. I'm using the little symbol. Okay? Now, there is an infinitely long line that also passes through those 2 points. I can talk about line BC, and I don't have to be showing it. Okay, so if I talk about line BC, you'd be thinking about that infinite line that goes through those 2 points. You'll know what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and draw that line. Now, a line can have other points. So, I can have this other point here. Maybe this is point D or something like that, okay? To name a line, you're just going to pick any 2 points, okay? So I could call this line BC, totally okay. I could call it line CB, totally okay. But again, it's just any 2 points, okay? So I could call it line BD and put a line symbol over the top. Notice I've got little arrows on the ends there. I could call it DB, I could call it DC, I could call it CD, so on and so forth, okay? So lots of different ways you can name lines. But notice it's always 2 points. Now, there's something that we'll talk about. This is really important. Sometimes people will say, well, why couldn't I just call this line D? I mean, it's a line that's got point D on it. Wouldn't that be an okay name? One of the ideas we're going to talk about is that your naming should always determine the kind of shape that you're talking about, okay? What does it mean when I say determine a shape? Well, here's what I mean. If a shape is determined, you know exactly which one I'm talking about, okay? So for example, let's say I had 2 crossing lines and I had point A there. If I talk about line A, you don't know, is it this line A? Is it this line A? Is there some other line that's passing through A that maybe wasn't shown in the picture, that just wasn't drawn, but maybe it exists? It's unclear, okay? Meanwhile, if you pick any 2 points, if I have point A and I have point B, there's only one line that can pass through both of those 2 points, okay? Whoops. I'll make those points a little bigger there, okay? Only one possible line can pass through both of those 2 points. And so what we say is that that line is determined by points A and B. In other words, there is no doubt, okay? Meanwhile, point A does not define those lines because there are multiple different lines that could go through. So the whole idea is we don't want confusion. If I say line AB, you know, hey, it's exactly that one line. Okay, there's no question about which line we're dealing with. And so most of the naming we're going to work with is going to come back to that idea, okay, of determining whatever kind of shape you're working with. Okay, well, let's talk about some other things. So we've talked a little bit about naming points, naming segments, naming lines. There's also something called array. Okay, array has a direction. It starts and it goes out in some direction. So for example, array might look something like this. Maybe I have point D and I have point E, okay? Now this point is called the endpoint. And if you're thinking about array in real life, you might think of something like a flashlight. You turn the flashlight on, the rays go out of the flashlight, okay? They don't come back in your face, they go one direction, okay? So the direction matters, okay? You start at the endpoint, you're going out in this direction. Because the order matters, the order of the points when you name array matter as well. You would call this array DE. It's starting at D, it's going in the direction of E, okay? You would not call it ray ED. Ray ED would be the ray that starts at this point and goes off in that direction, okay? We can talk about that ray, but it's a different ray because it's got a different direction, okay? Now, a ray could have multiple points. There are infinitely many points here. You could name as many other points as you want. So if I had point, let's say F, right here, this is also the ray that starts at D and goes out to F. So I could call this ray DF, okay? You gotta have the endpoint at that endpoint, but it can be any other point after that. So we could call this ray DF, we could call this ray DE. You know, if I had point Q out here, we could call it DQ. It's not an ad for Dairy Queen, but you get the idea, okay? That's how you name a ray, okay? Now, if I talk about EQ, that's a different ray. That's a ray that starts here and goes off in that direction. So there are other rays that are part of this diagram. And again, I could talk about ray EF, which is a ray that starts here and goes off infinitely in that direction, okay? When you draw the symbol, though, you always draw the symbol the same way. So even if I had a ray that went from point X to point Y, something like that, we would call it XY. Starts at X, goes in the direction of Y. This symbol will always be written the same way, okay? You don't turn the arrow a different way if the ray is pointing a different way, okay? But it's going to refer back to that diagram, okay? So that's how you name rays. Let's talk a little bit about angles. Section 1.2, we're going to focus really heavily on angles. So angles are actually made up of 2 rays that come together, okay? So maybe I could have a ray that does this and a ray that does this, okay? So an angle is normally named by 3 points, okay? And specifically, the middle point needs to be where the 2 rays come together, which is called the vertex, okay? So for example, maybe I could call this point A, this is point B, and this is point C, okay? So I could call this angle A, B, C. I move from A to B to C. That would be one way to name this, all right? Vertex point has to be in the center, all right? I could also go from C to B to A. So I could also call it angle CBA. Okay, notice I've got an angle symbol out there out front, okay? You can use a shortened naming sometimes, okay? Sometimes it is okay to just talk about this as angle B, okay? Just using the vertex point. I'm gonna come back in a minute, we're gonna talk about when that's appropriate and when it's not, because there are problems with calling it just angle B, and I'd like you to think about why that might be a problem, okay? You can also have a number, kind of a label. That's not an angle measure, that's just a number 1. Sometimes if you have a diagram with a bunch of angles that might number different angles, so let's say that's a number 1, I could refer to this as angle 1, okay? So if an angle has a number, you can use that to name the angle. If you just have a vertex, you can use the vertex point, or you can use 3 points, okay? Now, I want to come back. This is always the safest, using 3 points. And here's why. Remember at the start we talked about the idea that you want to determine the figure that you're talking about, okay? Well, here's why the order is so important. First of all, why can't I use 2 points to name an angle, okay? Well, if I talked about angle AB, are we talking about this angle here at this vertex? Or are we talking about the angle at this vertex between A and B? It's unclear, okay? It doesn't determine, it doesn't totally narrow it down for us, okay? Now I can talk about angle A, okay? And everybody knows I'm talking about this angle right here. I can talk about angle C, everybody knows I'm talking about this angle over here, all right? So why is it not always okay to use 1 letter? If you've thought about this a little bit, you might have come up with a solution. Here's the problem. What happens if you have more than 1 angle that comes together at a given point? Okay, if I talk about angle A, that could be this angle over here that has a vertex point at A. It could be this top angle that has a vertex point at A. It could be this side angle that has a vertex at A. By the way, we could put 2 angles together. We could have a straight angle here that includes this ray and that ray, and it could be this whole angle right here. We can combine angles together, and so it's not clear which angle A I'm talking about. So you would want 3 points here. Maybe you would have point, D, and you'd have point, N or something like that. Okay, we could have angle DAN. Okay, and then everybody knows we're dealing with this angle right here. Okay, or we could, we can name it going the other direction. You can also put numbers in here. So for example, you could have angle 1, angle 2, and angle 3. And so angle DAN, for example, would be the same thing as angle 2. Okay, so it's all about being clear and having no doubt which one you're talking about. In general, I would encourage you to try to use 3 points to name angles. Okay, but if you have 1 angle by itself, you can use just the vertex to name the angle. Okay, by the way, if you've used other geometry books, some other geometry books will talk about angles that are larger than a straight angle. Okay. In other words, there's an angle here, and some books will also say there's an angle out here, okay? Our book has a note in it at the start. All of the angles that we're going to deal with are going to be between a straight angle and 0 degrees, okay? Anything bigger than a straight angle right now, we're not going to consider to be an angle, okay? We'll deal with that when we deal with circular motion, but that's kind of down the road a little bit, okay? Oh, by the way, left this out, but I need to mention it. Remember I said you normally use 2 points to name a line. Okay, so I have point A, I have point B, I can talk about line AB, or I can talk about line BA. They do use something similar to the numbering for lines as well. You can have like a little cursive letter off to the side, like maybe like a little L, or like a little A or a little B, and you could refer to this as line L, for example. Okay, L is not a point on that line. It's just kind of like a little caption off to the side. Okay, and typically the place you'll see that might be maybe something kind of like this, where they'll have like line A, line B, and line C. And again, it's just very easy to see, oh, they named this A, they named that B, they named that C. You'll see that a lot in the book. I don't use it a lot when I'm writing about things, but they'll use it to direct your attention to different lines, so you should be aware of that. Let's see, anything else here? I think we've hit the high points there. So hopefully that gives you kind of a good idea. Definitely encourage you to read the section 1.1 carefully. There's stuff there that I didn't mention, but I think you can figure most of the other things out. Hopefully now you have a little better understanding about how you're supposed to name things and also why things are named the way they are.